The crystal chandeliers of the grand sterling ballroom hummed with a light that felt more like a spotlight at a trial than a gala. For Ellen Ripley, the air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the suffocating stench of judgment. She stood at the edge of the circular bar, her hand wrapped around a glass of sparkling water, watching the elite of the city spin in a choreographed dance of status and vanity. She was 32, the CEO of a tech logistics firm she had built from a garage startup into a multi-million-dollar empire, but in this room, none of that mattered. In the eyes of the sterling social circle, Ellen was a failure. Because tonight, like every night for the past 5 years, she was alone. Still flying solo, Ellen? I would have thought with all that boss babe energy, you could at least hire a date for the evening. The voice belonged to Sarah McLean, a woman whose only achievement was marrying into the McLean real estate fortune. She stood there, draped in silk, leaning heavily into the arm of her husband. Beside her, a cluster of women from the board of the charity gala giggled behind their lace fans. "It's a choice, Sarah," Ellen said, her voice steady despite the heat rising in her chest. "I've been busy building a future." "A future of what?" "Cats." Sarah laughed, the sound sharp and jagged. "A woman without a partner in this city is like a ship without a rudder, darling. You're just drifting. It's honestly a bit pathetic. We all feel for you, really. It must be so quiet in that big house of yours." The mockery wasn't just a whisper. It was a roar. Ellen felt the eyes of the room turning toward her. That successful single was the favorite target of the sterling elite. They couldn't stand her independence, so they labeled it as loneliness. They couldn't handle her power, so they called it a defect. But as the laughter reached a crescendo, the massive oak doors at the front of the hall didn't just open. They were held wide by security detail in black suits. The music faltered. The laughter died in Sarah's throat. A silence, heavy and expectant, washed over the room like a cold front. A man stepped into the light. He wasn't just elite. He was the son the elite revolved around. Elias McLean. Not the McLean Sarah had married, but the head of the entire dynasty, the reclusive, legendary titan who hadn't been seen at a public gathering in 3 years. He didn't look at the hosts. He didn't look at the cameras. His eyes scanned the room with a terrifying, singular focus until they landed directly on the woman being ridiculed. "Ellen." His voice boomed, deep and resonant, cutting through the silence like a blade. He began to walk toward her, and the crowd parted like the Red Sea. Sarah McLean turned pale, her hand dropping from her husband's arm. The questions hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Why was the most powerful man in the country walking toward the woman they had just called pathetic? And what was the secret that was about to turn this ballroom into a graveyard for their pride? Before I reveal the shocking connection that brought Elias McLean to his knees in front of everyone, I want to say a huge hello to all of you. We are so glad you're here. Whether you're watching from the rainy streets of London, the sunny coasts of Australia, or right here at home, how are you doing today? I truly hope your week is going amazing. If you're ready to see these bullies get exactly what's coming to them, do me a huge favor. Hit that subscribe button and join our family. It's the best way to make sure you never miss a moment of these stories. Are you subscribed yet? Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I love seeing how far our stories travel. Elias stopped exactly 6 inches from Ellen. The room held its breath. He didn't shake her hand. He didn't offer a polite nod. He reached out, his fingers brushing the stray hair from her forehead with a tenderness that felt like a lightning strike. "I'm late," Elias whispered, loud enough for the nearest row of socialites to gasp. "Forgive me. The flight from Dubai was delayed, and I couldn't stand the thought of you being in this room for 1 more minute without me by your side." Ellen looked up at him, her eyes shining with a secret that was about to shatter the sterling social order forever. The air in the ballroom felt like it had been sucked out by a vacuum. Sarah McLean stood frozen, her glass of vintage champagne trembling so violently that the liquid threatened to spill over the rim. The surrounding socialites, who moments ago were sharpening their tongues on Ellen's failure, were now physically recoiling as if the proximity to the alpha of the McLean empire might burn them. To the world, Ellen Ripley was a woman of iron and logistics. She was the ice queen of the tech sector, a woman who had clawed her way out of a working-class background to command a fleet of automated transport ships. Her deepest motivation wasn't greed. It was the memory of her mother, a woman who had worked 3 jobs only to be discarded by a corporate machine without a second thought. Ellen's fear wasn't being single. It was being dependent. She had built a fortress around her heart to ensure that no man could ever hold the keys to her security or her self-worth. But standing in front of Elias, that fortress didn't crumble. It found its matching wall. Elias McLean was the architect of the city's skyline, a man whose reputation for ruthlessness in the boardroom was only rivaled by his absolute silence regarding his private life. He was a man of shadows and steel, someone who viewed social gatherings as a waste of tactical time. Yet here he was, looking at Ellen with an intensity that made the surrounding opulence look like cheap tinsel. "Elias," Sarah stammered, her voice an octave higher than usual. "We didn't realize. We were just keeping Ellen company. We had no idea you two were acquainted." Elias didn't even turn his head. He kept his gaze locked on Ellen, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone. "Acquainted? Oh, that's a word for people who share a business card, Sarah. Ellen is the woman who saved my company 3 years ago when the board was trying to sell me out. She is the only person in this room whose mind is worth more than the clothes they're wearing." He finally turned, his silver eyes flashing with a cold, predatory light that made Sarah's husband, Robert, step back. "And I overheard your comment about the cats, Sarah. It's interesting that you worry about Ellen's quiet house. I find that the loudest rooms are usually the ones filled with people who have nothing of substance to say." The sting of the rebuke was physical. Ellen felt a strange, unfamiliar sensation, not just the triumph of being defended but the warmth of being understood. For 3 years, their relationship had been a masterpiece of discretion. It had started in a dimly lit boardroom during a hostile takeover and evolved into late-night phone calls about philosophy, logistics, and the burden of leadership. They were two suns orbiting each other, both too powerful to collide, yet unable to pull away. Elias had spent those years spoiling her in ways no one saw, sending anonymous investment tips to her firm, arranging for her mother's medical care under the guise of a corporate grant, and being the one voice at 3 a.m. that told her she was doing enough. He didn't want to change her, he wanted to fuel her. "Let's get out of here," Elias murmured, leaning closer. "I didn't fly halfway across the globe to watch you endure the company of people who couldn't even spell the word ambition." "I have a speech to give, Elias," Ellen said, her voice reclaiming its authority. "I'm the lead donor for the scholarship fund tonight. I'm not leaving until I've finished what I came for." A look of genuine, unfiltered pride crossed Elias's face. It was an expression so rare that if a photographer had caught it, it would have been the front page of every financial journal in the country. "Of course. My apologies, boss. I'll be in the front row. I want to make sure everyone sees exactly who they were laughing at." As Elias led her toward the VIP section, he pulled out a chair for her with a level of deference he had never shown a foreign dignitary. The shift in the room was tectonic. The invisible woman was now the center of gravity. But as Ellen took her seat, she caught a glimpse of Sarah whispering into her phone, her eyes darting toward the entrance. The mockery had ended, but the sabotage was just beginning. In a world where status is the only currency, Ellen had just become the most expensive person in the room, and there were those who would rather see her bankrupt than see her rise. The gala was hitting its peak. The air was charged with a mixture of reverence and frantic social climbing as the elite tried to recalibrate their attitudes toward Ellen. But as Ellen stood to walk toward the podium to deliver her keynote address, the double doors at the back of the ballroom swung open again. This time it wasn't a grand entrance. It was an intrusion. A man in a rumpled suit, clutching a digital tablet and followed by a small camera crew, marched into the center of the hall. It was Thomas Vance, a tabloid journalist known for The Sterling Sting, a digital program dedicated to tearing down the very people in this room. "Stop the music," Vance shouted, his voice amplified by a handheld megaphone. The orchestra trailed off into a confused silence. Ellen paused halfway to the stage, her heart sinking. She recognized Vance. He had been sniffing around her logistics firm for months, looking for a crack in her Ice Queen facade. "We're all so impressed by the sudden appearance of Mr. McLean," Vance sneered, gesturing toward Elias. "The single savior of the tech world finally has a man on her arm." But maybe the reason Ellen Ripley has been single for 5 years isn't because she's a boss. Maybe it's because she's a thief. A collective gasp rippled through the ballroom. Sarah McLean stepped forward, a triumphant, ugly smile returning to her face. She had clearly been the one to tip him off. "What is this nonsense?" Elias stood up, his presence so intimidating that the camera crew actually took a step back. Vance, if you don't leave this building in 10 seconds, I will buy the network you work for just to fire you in person. Buy whatever you want, McLean, Vance countered, holding up his tablet for the room to see. But can you buy back the proprietary code Ellen developed for her logistics platform? I have a sworn affidavit here from a former developer at Sterling Tech. He claims Ellen Ripley didn't build her empire. She stole the core algorithms from a defunct startup she was supposed to be mentoring 5 years ago. She's not a CEO. She's a corporate pirate. The screen on the tablet flickered to life, showing a series of documents, technical schematics and emails that looked damningly like Ellen's handwriting. The room, which had just been bowing to her, turned cold in an instant. The whispers started again, but this time they were sharper, deadlier. Fraud. Liar. No wonder she's alone. Who could trust her? Ellen felt the world tilt. She looked at the screen. The emails were hers, but they were stripped of context, edited to look like she was plotting a theft when she had actually been trying to save the developer's work from bankruptcy. She turned to Elias, expecting to see doubt. If there was one thing Elias McLean hated, it was a lack of integrity. He was a man of his word, and he expected the same from anyone in his circle. But Elias wasn't looking at the screen. He was looking at Sarah McLean. He saw the way she was clutching her phone, the way her eyes darted to Vance with a look of shared victory. Ellen, Elias said, his voice strangely calm in the middle of the storm. I didn't steal it, Elias, Ellen whispered, her voice cracking for the first time. I gave that man a way out. I paid him 10 times what the code was worth. I know, Elias said. Before Vance could continue his tirade, Elias stepped onto the stage, taking the microphone from the stunned MC. He didn't look at the crowd, he looked directly into the camera lens of the tabloid crew. You want a scandal, Vance? I'll give you one, Elias announced. The defunct startup you're referring to was a subsidiary of McLean International. I know exactly what Ellen did 5 years ago because I was the one who signed the non-disclosure agreement. She didn't steal that code. She saved it from being liquidated by a board of directors that wanted to bury it. And as for the developer, who gave you that affidavit? Elias pulled his own phone from his pocket and tapped a button. A voice recording began to play through the ballroom's massive speakers. Yes, Sarah McLean said she'd pay off my gambling debts if I just signed the statement. I don't care about the code. I just need the money. Ripley was always too good for this crowd anyway. The silence that followed was absolute. Sarah McLean's face went from triumph to a sickly, pale gray. That was 5 minutes ago, Elias said, his voice dropping to a low, lethal silk. My security team is very efficient. The twist wasn't just that Ellen was innocent. It was that Elias had been protecting her long before they walked into this room. The inciting incident had tried to break her, but it had only revealed the sheer scale of the power standing behind her. Now, Elias said, turning to Ellen and offering his hand to lead her to the podium. I believe the Queen of Logistics has a speech to give. And if I hear one more whisper in this room that isn't applause, I will make sure the Sterling name is nothing more than a footnote in a bankruptcy filing. Ellen took his hand, her spirit catching fire. The incident that was supposed to destroy her had just become her coronation. The atmosphere in the grand Sterling ballroom had shifted from a toxic shark tank to a silent, terrified courtroom. As Elias stood by the podium, his presence felt like a physical weight pressing down on the lungs of every socialite who had ever whispered a slight against Ellen. Sarah McLean was trembling so violently that her husband had to physically steer her toward a corner, away from the icy gaze of the family patriarch. But for Ellen, the tension wasn't just external. As she stepped up to the microphone, the adrenaline of the confrontation began to mix with a deeper, more complex realization. Elias hadn't just defended her. He had revealed a level of surveillance and protection she hadn't fully consented to. Tonight was supposed to be about the future, Ellen began, her voice projecting with a new razor-sharp clarity. It was about the scholarship students who are waiting to see if their hard work actually matters in a world that seems to value gossip over grit. She delivered a speech that was less of a thank you and more of a manifesto. She spoke of resilience, of the dignity of being unattached to the shallow expectations of others, and of the power of a woman's silence. When she finished, the applause didn't just happen, it exploded. The same people who had mocked her 5 minutes ago were now standing, their faces masks of desperate approval. As they stepped off the stage, the rising tension began to manifest in the form of social desperation. The elite were practically tripping over themselves to reach her. "Ellen, darling, I always knew you were the brightest star in the room," gushed a woman who an hour ago had been laughing at the cat joke. "We must have lunch. My son is starting a venture capital firm and I told him, you simply must meet Ellen Ripley." Elias stepped in, his arms sliding possessively around Ellen's waist. The heat of his hand through her silk dress was a grounding wire, but his words were a warning. "Ellen is booked for the next 6 months, Lydia. And I believe your firm is currently under review by my compliance team. I'd focus on that if I were you." They navigated the crowd like a battleship cutting through glass. But as they reached a quieter alcove near the terrace, Ellen turned to him, the glow of the victory fading into a serious, searching look. "You've been watching my firm's legal battles, Elias? Since when?" "Since the day you told me you didn't need any help," Elias replied, his voice dropping to a low, intimate register. "I respected your boundaries, Ellen. I didn't interfere. But I kept a pulse on the people who wanted to hurt you. In my world, you don't wait for the fire to start. You remove the fuel. I built my company so I wouldn't have to be a McLean project," she whispered, the tension between her love for him and her need for independence sparking in the air. "You aren't a project," he countered, stepping closer until she could feel the steady beat of his heart. "You're an equal. And an equal deserves to know when a knife is being sharpened behind her back. Sarah and her circle didn't just want to mock you, they wanted to take your contracts. I wasn't protecting a single woman, Ellen. I was protecting my partner." The romantic subplot was no longer just a secret. It was a collision of two powerhouses. But before they could resolve the friction of their shared vulnerability, a red herring emerged. One of Ellen's lead developers, a man she trusted explicitly, approached them with a look of sheer panic. "Ellen, the server logs. Someone didn't just leak the emails. They've initiated a backdoor wipe of our logistics network. If we don't stop it, the entire fleet stalls in 20 minutes. The sabotage wasn't just a social hit, it was a physical threat to her empire. And the person behind the console wasn't Sarah. It was someone much closer to the technical heart of her company. They're trying to force a bankruptcy," Elias noted, his eyes narrowing as he checked his own encrypted device. "If the fleet stalls, the insurance triggers a default clause. Someone is trying to buy your company for pennies in the next hour." The tension moved from the ballroom to the digital battlefield. Ellen looked at Elias, then at her developer. She had to choose: trust the man who had been her secret shield, or rely on the skills she had used to build her world alone. "I'm going to the server room at the satellite office," Ellen decided, her eyes flashing with a cold fire. "Elias, stay here. If I leave with you, they'll know I'm panicked. Keep the sharks at bay. Make them think we're celebrating." "Ellen. I started this in a garage, Elias. I can finish it in a gala dress." As she slipped out the side exit, leaving the glitter and the whispers behind, the true rising tension took hold. She was a woman alone again, but this time the stakes weren't her reputation. They were everything she had ever built. The satellite office was a stark contrast to the opulence of the ballroom, cold, smelling of ozone and ionized air, lit only by the frantic blinking of server racks. Ellen stood over the main terminal, her silk gown pinned back with a heavy-duty cable tie, her fingers flying across the mechanical keyboard. The backdoor wipe was sophisticated, a logic bomb designed to erase her proprietary routing algorithms. But as she traced the origin of the command, her blood turned to ice. The encryption key wasn't stolen. It was a primary key, one of only 2 in existence. The midpoint revelation didn't come from a computer screen. It came from the doorway. "You always were too smart for your own good, Ellen." Ellen spun around. Standing there wasn't a corporate rival or a McLean operative. It was John McLean, Sarah's husband, and the man Ellen had considered her only true friend within the elite circle for years. He was the one who had encouraged her to keep her relationship with Elias a secret, for her own protection. "John." Ellen's voice was a whisper of disbelief. "You're the one? Not Sarah." "Sarah is a distraction," John said, stepping into the blue light of the servers. He looked different. The bumbling, henpecked husband act had vanished, replaced by a sharp, predatory greed. She's the loud noise that keeps everyone looking at the gossip while I look at the ledgers. Elias has everything. The name, the throne, the legacy. I'm just the cousin who manages the real estate. But if your company defaults, the McLean board has a standing order to absorb it. And as the head of acquisitions, I would control the most advanced logistics network in the hemisphere. The betrayal was total. Everything Ellen believed about her safety in the shadows had been a lie fed to her by the man trying to dismantle her. You used your own wife to humiliate me, Ellen realized, her horror growing. You set her up to be the villain so you could be the savior who acquired my assets when I broke down. It would have worked too, John said, checking his watch. If Elias hadn't shown up. He was never supposed to be here tonight. Why did he come, Ellen? Why now? Because he loves me, you coward. Ellen spat, her fingers hitting the final sequence to lock the server. Love. John laughed, a dry, rattling sound. Elias doesn't love. He collects. And right now he's collecting your enemies in that ballroom while I'm finishing the job here. He pulled a small high-frequency jammer from his pocket and tossed it into the server rack. The screens went black. The cooling fans ground to a halt. The fleet is blind now, Ellen. In 10 minutes the defaults trigger. You can be single and broke, or you can sign the emergency merger over to me right now. I'll make sure you keep a seat on the board. You can even keep your house. This was the moment that challenged everything Ellen believed. She had prided herself on her independence, but she was trapped in a room with a man who had been sabotaging her for 5 years under the guise of friendship. But then the intercom on the wall crackled to life. It wasn't the office security. It was a direct, encrypted patch from the ballroom. John, Elias's voice boomed through the room, cold as the vacuum of space. I'm looking at the transfer of funds you made to the developer's gambling account. And I'm looking at the offshore shell company you used to buy the default insurance on Ellen's fleet. John froze. How? The jammer. You're using a McLean encrypted jammer, you fool. Elias's voice was closer now, vibrating with a terrifying, protective fury. I designed those protocols. Did you really think I wouldn't notice when one of my own devices went active in my partner's office? The screen on the main terminal flickered back to life, but it didn't show the logistics code. It showed the grand ballroom. Elias was standing in the center of the room, Sarah McLean sobbing at his feet, and the police were moving in on the high society guests who had helped John funnel the money. Ellen, Elias said, his image appearing on the monitor. His eyes were no longer cold. They were filled with a raw, shared vulnerability. I'm outside the door. But I won't come in. You told me you wanted to finish this. The override code is your mother's birthday. I never forgot. The revelation was twofold. The man she thought was a friend was a monster, and the man she thought was a collector had been paying attention to every detail of her soul for years. Ellen didn't hesitate. She entered the code. The logistics network surged back to life, a golden map of ships and trucks appearing across the screens. The default was averted. The Empire was safe. She turned to John, who was now staring at the door in terror. You were wrong about one thing, John, Ellen said, her voice like tempered steel. I'm not single, because I'm alone. I'm single because I was waiting for someone who was strong enough to stand beside me, not in front of me. The door didn't burst open. It opened slowly. Elias stood there, not as a king coming to reclaim his property, but as a man waiting for his equal. The server room was silent, save for the hum of the cooling fans and the distant, fading sound of John McLean being led away in zip ties. Ellen stood in the center of the room, the adrenaline that had fueled her defense now evaporating, leaving behind a hollow, bone-deep exhaustion. Elias remained in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the harsh fluorescent light of the hallway. The victory was complete, but the cost was beginning to crystallize. I have my security team scrubbing the ballroom, Elias said, his voice quiet. The police have Sarah's statement. John's assets will be frozen by morning. Your company is secure, Ellen. He stepped toward her, but Ellen took a small, instinctive step back. The darkest hour wasn't a physical threat. It was the crushing weight of the world they lived in. Is it? Ellen asked, her voice trembling. Elias, look at us. In one night, we've destroyed two of the most prominent families in the city. The headlines tomorrow won't be about John's fraud or my logistics network. They'll be about the McLean scandal. They'll say I used you to eliminate my rivals. They'll say you bought a mistress and called her a partner. Let them say what they want, Elias countered, his jaw tightening. We know the truth. But the truth isn't what matters in that ballroom. Ellen cried, the frustration finally boiling over. I spent my entire life building a reputation so I would never be just someone's wife or just someone's daughter. And tonight I became a headline. I became a pawn in a McLean family war. Everything I worked for is now tainted by the association. The separation felt physical. The true mate-like bond they had cultivated in the shadows was being shredded by the very spotlight Elias had used to save her. Elias looked at her, and for the first time the cold king looked truly helpless. He realized that in protecting her from the sharks, he had inadvertently caged her in his own shadow. Is that what you think this is? Elias asked, his voice thick with a sudden sharp pain. An association? Ellen, I've spent 3 years waiting for the moment I could hold your hand in public without it feeling like a liability to your career. I didn't step onto that stage for my family. I stepped on it for you. And that's the problem. Ellen whispered. You saved me. And now, every time someone looks at my success, they'll see your hand in it. They'll see the McLean protection. I'm more invisible now than I was when they were mocking me for being single. The silence that followed was insurmountable. The obstacles weren't corporate. They were the deepest fears of two people who had survived by being self-reliant. Ellen felt the despair of realizing that love might be the one thing that could actually destroy her independence. Elias walked to the terminal, his fingers hovering over the global release key for the McLean PR wire. If you want me to walk away, if you want me to issue a statement saying tonight was purely a business intervention and that there is no us, I will do it. I will give you back your solitude, Ellen. If that's what it takes for you to feel like yourself again. He looked at her, his heart in his eyes, offering her the one thing he didn't want to give, a life without him. Ellen looked at the screen, then at the man she had loved in the quiet hours of the night. The situation appeared hopeless. If she stayed, she was a McLean project. If she left, she lost the only soul who truly saw her. Ellen turned her face away, the tears finally falling. I don't know who I am when the whole world is watching us, Elias. And I don't know if I can stay to find out. She walked past him, leaving the office and the man she loved in the dark. The cold king was left standing alone in the server room, the golden maps of her success still glowing on the screens behind him, mocking his power to fix everything but the one thing that mattered. The rain began to fall in heavy rhythmic sheets against the windshield of Ellen's car as she sat in the darkened parking lot of a quiet park. The city lights blurred into streaks of neon and gray, reflecting the internal chaos of her mind. For 3 hours she had driven aimlessly, trying to find the Ice Queen who had walked into the gala, the woman who didn't need anyone. But she couldn't find her. Because that woman was a shell, a suit of armor built to prevent the very thing she was feeling now, a profound aching void. The turning point didn't come from a grand gesture or a corporate breakthrough. It came from a simple, crumpled piece of paper she found in her clutch, a letter from a 10-year-old girl named Maya, one of the scholarship recipients Ellen had spoken to earlier that night. Dear Ms. Ripley, the letter read in loopy, uncertain handwriting. My mom says you're amazing because you don't wait for people to tell you what to do. I want to be a boss like you. But mostly I want to be brave enough to show people who I really am, even if they don't like it. Thank you for being brave first. Ellen stared at the words. She had been so afraid of being overshadowed by Elias that she had forgotten what true bravery looked like. Bravery wasn't being alone. It was being authentic. It was standing in the light, even when the light was messy and the shadows were long. She realized then that her independence wasn't a fragile thing that could be stolen by a man's love or a headline's lie. Her independence was her choice. And she was choosing to be miserable for the sake of an image she didn't even like. I'm done hiding, Ellen whispered to the empty car. She didn't call a driver. She didn't call a PR team. She put the car in gear and drove back to the Sterling ballroom. The gala was over, the staff clearing away the remnants of the night's wreckage. But there on the front steps of the building sat Elias McLean. He had discarded his tuxedo jacket, his white sleeves rolled up, looking less like a titan of industry and more like a man waiting for the world to end. He didn't stand up when she pulled to the curb. He just looked at her, his eyes weary but filled with a spark of hope so bright it was painful to see. I haven't issued the statement, Elias said as she stepped out of the car, her heels clicking on the wet pavement. I couldn't do it. I realized that giving you solitude was just another way of me deciding what you needed. I'm sorry, Ellen. I was trying to fix a problem that wasn't mine to solve. Ellen stopped a few feet away from him. The rain soaked through her hair, but she didn't care. You didn't fix me, Elias. And you didn't save my company. You just stood by me while I saved it. She walked toward him, her hand reaching out to touch his face. I was so afraid that being with you meant losing myself. But tonight I realized that the only time I felt lost was when I walked away from you. Elias stood up then, his hands finding her waist, pulling her into the warmth of his presence. I don't want a shadow, Ellen. I want a partner who makes me better. I want the woman who can lock down a server room and a ballroom in the same hour. Then let them talk, Ellen said, her voice reclaiming its iron strength, but this time, it was infused with love. Let the headlines say what they want. We'll just have to give them something better to write about. The turning point was the moment Ellen realized that her worth wasn't determined by the sterling elite or a public's perception. It was determined by the courage to love and be loved in return. We have work to do, Elias murmured, his forehead resting against hers. John's trial, the merger, the fallout. Tomorrow, Ellen promised, her lips inches from his. Tonight I'm not a CEO. And I'm certainly not single. I'm just yours. As they stood together on the steps of the building where she had been mocked only hours before, the silence was no longer heavy. It was a new beginning. The Cold King and the Ice Queen had finally found the fire. The morning after the gala didn't bring a quiet retreat. It brought a storm of a different kind. By 8 a.m. the front gates of the McLean estate were swarmed by news vans, and Ellen's phone was a glowing brick of notifications. The scandal of John McLean's arrest and the unmasking of the city's most powerful secret couple had sent the stock market into a tailspin. But the real climax wasn't happening in the press. It was happening in the McLean International boardroom. The Old Guard, a group of 5 men who had controlled the McLean wealth for 40 years, had called an emergency session. Their goal was simple. Use the scandal to strip Elias of his chairmanship and force Ellen's company into a hostile takeover to cleanse the family name. You've turned a private matter into a public circus, Elias, the lead board member, a man named Arthur Sterling, sneered. And this woman, she is a liability. Her logistics network is a target now. We are moving to vote for your removal. Ellen stood at the back of the room, still wearing the clothes from the night before, but her presence was more commanding than any man in a 3-piece suit. She didn't wait for Elias to defend her. She walked to the head of the table, tossing a heavy folder onto the mahogany surface. You want to talk about liabilities, Arthur? Ellen's voice was a low, dangerous hum. Let's talk about the offshore accounts I found while I was fixing the server wipe last night. It turns out John wasn't working alone. He was funneling McLean assets into Sterling Tech for years to artificially inflate your family's stock. The color drained from Arthur's face. The board members looked at each other in sudden, panicked silence. I didn't just save my fleet last night, Ellen continued, her eyes scanning the room with the precision of a predator. I mapped the entire network of corruption. If you vote to remove Elias, or if you make one more move against my company, this folder goes to the SEC in 5 minutes. And I don't think Sterling will look very good on a prison jumpsuit. Elias stood up, leaning his hands on the table, his shadow falling over the men who had tried to betray him. Ellen isn't just my partner in private, gentlemen. As of this morning, McLean International and Ripley Logistics are undergoing a full, transparent merger. She will be the CEO of the combined entity. I will be stepping back to oversee the global expansion. The twist was the ultimate reversal. They had tried to use her status as a single woman to make her invisible, then tried to use her relationship to make her a pawn. Instead, she had just become their boss. The vote. Elias prompted, his voice like the click of a trigger. Motion withdrawn, Arthur whispered, his head bowing. The room cleared in a flurry of hushed, terrified conversations. Ellen and Elias were left alone in the massive boardroom. The sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the city they now truly controlled together. Elias walked over to her, his hand finding hers. You were more heroic today than I've ever seen anyone in this room. You didn't just save us, Ellen. You redefined the game. I told you, Ellen said, a small, triumphant smile playing on her lips. I don't wait for people to tell me what to do. I just do it. The climactic resolution wasn't just about winning a corporate battle. It was about the total, satisfying destruction of the people who had tried to diminish her. She had used her skills, her grit, and her authentic connection to Elias to silence every doubt. 1 year later, the Sterling Ballroom was once again filled with the city's elite, but the atmosphere was unrecognizable. The air was no longer thick with the scent of predatory judgment. It was charged with a quiet, respectful energy. The unmarried woman they had once mocked was now the most influential figure in the room, and her presence was no longer a target. It was an inspiration. Ellen Ripley stood at the center of a circle of young entrepreneurs, her laughter bright and genuine. She wasn't hiding in the shadows, and she wasn't clinging to a man's arm for validation. She stood on her own 2 feet, a glass of water in one hand and the future of the city's economy in the other. Elias McLean watched her from across the room, a glass of dark amber liquid in his hand. He wasn't hovering. He didn't need to. He watched with the quiet, profound pride of a man who knew he was looking at his equal. When their eyes met, there was a silent, electric communication. A shared memory of the night the world tried to break them and failed. The cold king had been transformed too. He was more accessible, his leadership defined by the transparency and integrity Ellen had brought into his life. Together they had formed the Ripley McLean Foundation, which had already sent 300 students to college on full-ride scholarships. Sarah McLean was nowhere to be found. After John's conviction, she had been quietly exiled to a small property in the countryside. Her social standing evaporated along with her husband's stolen wealth. The people who had once giggled at her cat jokes were now the same people fighting for a 5-minute meeting with Ellen. The romantic subplot had found its earned, genuine resolution. There was no grand, televised wedding. They didn't need a ceremony to prove what the world already knew. Instead, there were quiet mornings in the garden, shared coffee over logistics reports, and the unwavering knowledge that neither of them would ever have to stand alone again. "Ms. Ripley," a young woman whispered, approaching Ellen with a look of awe. "I'm starting a logistics firm in the South. They told me a woman couldn't handle the tech side. But then I saw what you did." Ellen smiled, reaching out to squeeze the young woman's hand. "They'll tell you a lot of things to make you feel small. Just remember, your silence isn't a weakness. It's the sound of you getting ready to win." As the gala drew to a close, Ellen and Elias walked out the front doors together. The rain from a year ago was replaced by a clear, starlit sky. He tucked her arm into his, a simple, intimate gesture that spoke volumes. "You ready to go home?" Elias asked, his voice low and warm. "Almost," Ellen said, looking back at the building one last time. "I just wanted to see if anyone had anything else to say." Elias looked at the quiet, respectful crowd at the entrance. "I think you silenced them for a lifetime, Ellen." They stepped into the waiting car, leaving the whispers of the past behind. The successful single woman had found her match, her mission, and her voice. And as the city lights twinkled in the rearview mirror, she knew that the best chapters of her story were the ones they were writing together. "I've had such an amazing time telling this story of grit, hidden truths, and the ultimate comeback with you. It's so satisfying to see characters like Ellen finally get the respect and love they deserve, isn't it? What part of her journey resonated with you the most? Was it her standing up to the board, or that final moment of peace with Elias? Let me know in the comments. Your feedback keeps me inspired to create more of these high-stakes dramas. And if you're ready for the next adventure, don't forget to subscribe so you're the first to know when a new story drops. Thank you for being an incredible audience. See you in the next story.